Good afternoon, faculty, fellow speakers, and participants of the conclave. Thank you for inviting me to this conclave. I think the theme is very appropriate, India Next. I think just to lay some perspective to this, somebody talked about Professor Prahalad. In 2007, late Professor C.K. Prahalad laid out a vision for India at 75. That vision is now being carried forward by the Confederation of Indian Industry, CII, and we are in some way associated with that. So I think what that initiative is about is, from 1947 to 2022, India will have completed 75 years since independence, and he laid out a vision for where he would like India to be in 2022. And there are a number of elements of that vision that he shared prior to his demise. And one of the key elements was about governance and how governance can be improved in various ways, and he specifically named technology as one of the key drivers for that. So I think that context, India Next and the vision for India at 75 are pretty aligned. So I'd like to talk about transformation through e-governance during the course of the next 15 to 20 minutes. So first, a context for e-governance, and then I'd like to talk about some trends in 3 or 4 areas. Trends in the areas of how the business models related to e-governance are likely to change or maybe already changing. Secondly, how the role of technology in e-governance is evolving and how we're going to be seeing new technologies coming in that area, and some of the things that we're doing today possibly may be passé. The role for capacity building in e-governance and how institutional capacity will actually grow. Today, that's one of the weaknesses in our e-governance model. The capacity of e-governance to take on e-governance and implement e-governance is fairly limited. And finally, I'd like to end with how the focus of e-governance itself, the way we know e-governance today itself, may change, and what gets classified under e-governance may be quite different over the years. So first, the e-governance context. So there are various definitions to e-governance laid down by various bodies, and I'd like to quote 3 such definitions here. The first one by the World Bank, the second one by OECD, and the third one by the European Union. You'll see that there is some element of difference between the way e-governance is perceived by each of these organizations, and that I think is at the root of something like e-governance. It's a very vast domain, so the way different people look at it is going to be different, and what constitutes e-governance itself, there are some subtleties that get added. So for example, OECD is a very generic definition, essentially talking about use of technology and the internet for governance. Whereas the European Union goes far beyond and talks about how it can influence the democratic processes also. And the World Bank talks about various initiatives in various areas. Essentially, we get classified into 3 areas: government to government, which is referred to as G to G, government to business, G to B, and government to citizen initiatives. And I think India's national e-governance plan, formulated by the Government of India, has elements of G to G, G to B, and G to C all embedded in the policy, and it's a fairly comprehensive plan. Now again, given that it's a very vast domain, what is e-governance? It can be a variety of things. And I'd like to maybe illustrate each one with an example of what I mean and how it's been applied in some parts of the world. It can be an end-to-end collaborative system which helps in bringing together the entire healthcare establishment, either in a city, a state, a region, or even a country. Denmark, for example, has implemented a collaborative healthcare system for the entire country. It's a small country, it's fairly easier to do it. But they've done it in such a manner that somebody can use a healthcare provider or hospital anywhere in the country, and his records are available for access by that hospital, irrespective of where he went previously. The records are available. Similarly, there are initiatives around the world for disease surveillance networks. With the epidemics growing and some of these contagious diseases coming in, there's an urgent need for that, and a part of a collaborative healthcare system can be a surveillance network for diseases. The second example is an e-governance application could be an emergency response system which integrates various things. It could be integrating weather systems, it could be integrating the traffic information, it could be integrating with the sensors related to earthquakes, etc. So there are a variety of things that can be integrated into this. Now this is actually being done in the city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Now that's a very comparable city to Mumbai. In fact, in terms of demographics, location, being close to the sea, the size of the city, the presence of slums as part of the city is very similar to Bombay. So an emergency response system for the city of Rio Rio de Janeiro actually captures a lot of information. It integrates micro weather forecasting for a couple of days henceforth and builds that into the emergency management for the city. So that's the second application, second area where e-governance is widely used. The third one related to virtual trading center, I think the best example of that possibly lies within our country itself, the ITC e-Chopal initiative. Although it does not possibly provide a single logistic command center, I think the e-Chopal initiative has brought together farmers and the rest of the market constituents wonderfully well under an online platform and provided them far more access to the market and better prices also. It could also, e-governance could also refer to web services available in various domains. In the Indian context, for example, the state of Andhra Pradesh implemented e-procurement very early on, many years back. And I think as of date, most of the transactions related to any government procurement happen through e-procurement. So there are a variety of ways in which we can look at e-governance, and I think these four are just a flavor for what can constitute e-governance. Of course, there are people who say even the EVM machines, the electronic voting machines that are used in elections today in India are some form of e-governance. So I think the domain is very vast and the jury is still out on what exactly can be a definition under which kind of bracket everything. Now moving on, I'd like to talk about some trends in e-governance in India and what possibly will be the direction of the way e-governance goes forward in India. So I'd like to talk about in four buckets that I listed out earlier. One is related to changing business models. Second is related to change of the role of technology. Third is about the institutional capacity that's available and how that will change going forward. And fourth is how the focus of e-governance itself is changing in the country and over the years how that will change. So the first one, I think, is the increasing nature of linkages between industry and government when it comes to doing e-governance projects. From being a supplier or a vendor, there's actually a partnership building up, and the public-private partnerships that we see in many e-governance projects are an outcome of this. In fact, the National E-Governance Plan of the Government of India has a number of components to it. Out of the 5 key components that are listed as key elements of the plan, one of them is a stated direction to use the private sector to deliver e-governance. The public-private partnerships are a key stated direction of the plan. However, there are going to be challenges in that because there are going to be the lack of congruence of objectives, the profit motive of private sector vis-a-vis the social objective of government. So there are challenges that need to be resolved. But the fact of the matter is, I think in India, given various issues related to funding and things like that, it is going to be the way forward for e-governance, how getting the private sector involved, and more we're going to be seeing that. The second change in the business model is the expectation of the vendor being a partner. I mean, again, this is a consequence of the public-private partnership, of the vendor being a partner in investments, risks, and rewards, and sharing in all these with the government. So the government will not be putting up all the funds and expecting the private sector to merely run that or operate that. The private sector partner is expected to bring in the funding to run the projects, typically over a period. In e-governance, typical duration of the tenure of PPP would be around 5 to 7 years. He brings in the funds, shares in the risks or the rewards related to the initiative with the government. And there's going to be an increasing move towards pay-as-you-use models where the private sector partner would be expected to take on the responsibility for running the project, and the usage determines the revenue model for the partner. So there are risks involved. There would be no guarantees in terms of revenues. The partner shares in the way the business runs, the same way it runs. For example, today IBM is a partner to a number of telcos like Vodafone, Idea, as well as Bharti Airtel. The model works on the principle that IBM invests in the entire technology infrastructure to run the business and shares in the revenues and the profits based on the growth in business. So if the business does not grow, then we stand to lose. If the business grows, then we tend to get a share in the profits. So such a model is likely to be extended to the e-governance initiatives also over time. So in terms of where we are today, I think from being at the bottom where we were, where the private sector was largely involved in hardware networking and supply of software, to then move into the next stage of being a partner where applications get implemented by the private sector. We are now at the stage in India where governments are increasingly beginning to use the private sector to implement projects where they are managing the projects. But the final stage of the government moving towards an outcome-based project is still yet to happen, where ultimately the government is not interested, should not be interested rather, in whether we use technology X or technology Y and how it's implemented. The government essentially would be interested in having service levels defined and the service levels being met. So essentially an outcome-based approach, which is currently not, we are not there right now, and that's where I think it will move, e-governance. The last aspect of the business model thing that I'd like to talk about is possibly the area of shared services. And I think this is something that we need to propagate in a big way, because e-governance projects, many of them often tend to be high-cost projects also. And given the constraints of funding in our country and competing priorities for the same scarce funds, there are bound to be things like debates like saying that should these funds go into e-governance or should it go into basic priorities like shelter or education. So I think given that states are going to be facing these issues over time, and if there's a model that can evolve where multiple states can possibly share the same e-governance infrastructure. For example, the nature of land records or property computerization is not significantly different between states. But why is it that all states are doing this independently? So there's a need where there's possibly a case for multiple states sharing the same infrastructure and using it in such a manner that the costs get divided amongst them. So it could be cities, it could be states, it could be multiple regions. For example, the entire Northeast region may not be a viable proposition for any single private sector player to go and invest and set up infrastructure there. But if you're able to combine it as a region, it makes sense and it may actually make a viable case for something to be done on a shared services model. And the shared services could be of multiple types. It could be for applications, for infrastructure, on a variety of areas. And I think shared services can actually be a catalyst for accelerated e-governance. Now, moving on to technology, the role of technology in e-governance, I think solutions will start being available in boxes. I think people talk about how people in India are very comfortable with mobiles. If a computing device can be as simple to use as a device, as a mobile device, I think the uptake will be far higher. Second is, I think technology will soon become a utility service, even for e-governance services. We don't possibly ask for where our electricity comes from or how it comes from, what is technology behind the electricity generation or the distribution or water network, or even the gas for that matter. So similarly, technology will soon become a utility for governance and people will start using it and pay for any services that they use. I think an earlier speaker spoke about the increasing role of e-participation and social media, the way it's transforming. I think the Arab Spring and a lot of examples got taken. But I think it's a fact that today, most of the e-governance initiatives in our country are not in a position to kind of accommodate e-participation and social media in the initiatives that are being planned. And increasingly, that will be the need of the hour. So we will see e-participation coming in and all these initiatives will need to incorporate them as part of the governance strategy. I think this is a point that all the previous speakers today have made, the kind of penetration of the mobile devices in India. I don't know how many of you have taken note of this observation some time back, that the number of people with access to sanitation in India is far lesser than the number of people with mobiles. So, when you say access to sanitation, it means being able to have access to a toilet within 5 minutes walking distance. So the number of people with access to sanitation in India is far lesser than the number of people with mobiles. One way of looking at this is this a case of misplaced priorities? But leaving that aside, the fact remains that the uptake, the technology of the mobile has been so widely accepted that I think that is the way forward in all the governance initiatives that we have in the country. In fact, an appropriate theme for your next conclave could possibly be M-governance, because that's the way the direction India is taking is actually everything is going to be revolving around mobiles as the device around which life revolves. You have the power of pull, the reach, as well as the push. You're able to personalize data, you're able to have convenient access, and you're able to actually, if you use a mobile device as part of the governance strategy, it's possible to determine who's sending it, where they are, and why, at what point of time. So a lot of additional information gets captured based on the location of the person, which currently is an issue. It's not something that gets done. And the vast user base that's there for that makes it the ideal device to be able to leverage for e-governance in the country. Now, the changing role of technology, I think one point that I'd like to add here, which possibly is the increasing need and the increasing use that will be made of sensors and real-time data. Now, today, most of our initiatives around e-governance basically use data in some form. They possibly use yesterday's data or last month's data for a lot of analysis. But increasingly, real-time data will be the need of the hour, and people will want real-time data for better decision-making. Sensors. Today, our initiatives are largely, if you ask me, around how to improve services related to business or citizens. But if you look at something like, let's say an example of a water network. If there is an outage, a breakdown of the water pipeline, the impact it will have can be very significant. Today, there are technologies available which can enable one to determine the quality of a pipeline using condition-based monitoring and use that data to be able to integrate it with the water networking system to say that if we don't take up adequate repairs here or replace it, there's a possibility of an outage to an entire city or an entire region. Now, that can be something very significant. So if you're able to incorporate real-time data and incorporate that within your governance procedures, a lot of the issues related to governance and outages can be avoided. So that's the point around being able to use sensors in real time for decision-making purposes. The second is being able to use data related to modeling and using that for planning purposes. So traffic data, water data, etc. I mean, for example, I think all of you would have read about the grid collapse that happened, the northern grid collapse that happened a couple of months back, which resulted in many states being totally out of power for a couple of days. That's very serious. But today, there are technologies again available which can allow you to sense the state of the network, the state of the grid at any point of time. And if a state is overdrawing from the grid at any point of time, you can either stop the state from doing so, or you can set up enough warning signals to make sure that you have a drawdown from the other states which is a little lower, or take some of the appropriate action. Essentially, you can be proactive with real-time information, and you're able to plan for traffic on the networks or electricity on the networks. The last aspect is how you can factor in how uncertainty will get factored in into the e-governance process. The third aspect I want to talk about in terms of trend is, I think today we have a pretty bad situation in terms of the institutional capacity for e-governance in the country. There are e-governance initiatives happening across the country, but that is happening in spite of the low capacity for e-governance both within the government and in the private sector. So I think ability to be able to take on large projects and execute them in a successful manner demands that capacity be built up. And there are a number of imperatives also for that. PPP is state direction, so the private sector also needs to invest and develop that capacity. So I think some initiatives happened. Government of India has launched a scheme where e-governance postgraduate programs are have been launched, and 2 such programs have been launched in 2 leading institutions at TAPME and at IIM Indore. I think there's an increasing need for leading institutions such as yours to be also taking up such programs to make sure that we're able to build the capacity for e-governance in the country, in the youth who are coming out. The second part of it is, apart from institutional capacity, there's also need for an appreciation to be built up for e-governance. So people need to appreciate the value of technology in governance and how e-governance can help. So courses in the area of appreciating e-governance also need to be factored in and built. So the last segment I'd like to talk about is the area of the changing focus of e-governance. And in that, I'd like to talk about 3 areas. The first one is processes. Today, most of the initiatives in e-governance, barring a few, are essentially about computerization of existing processes. So there are initiatives which actually have process reengineering, but they are the exception more than the rule. So when you have the situation, some of the processes that we're actually following are actually from the British Raj. So, I mean, today we are still following them blindly, nobody questions them, so the same process gets implemented. In fact, a study by IIM Ahmedabad has shown that in the area of land record computerization, some of the data that's actually there, the people who are actually administering it don't even know what the data is used for or required for. But the fact is, to remove it, it needs a series of approvals, so it remains a system, nobody uses it. So the process reengineering is something that needs to be built in, and I think Mr. Sam Pitoda said it very effectively when he said that I think if we don't implement process reengineering as part of our government process, there's a huge cost to be paid later on. So that's something that will slowly increase. The second thing is, I think a study by NISG, the National Institute of Smart Government, has shown that the number of interactions that various entities in the Indian system have with government are fairly large. An urban citizen has around 50 interactions with 10 departments on an average. A large business has around 500 interactions with 100 government departments. So, and everywhere a citizen or an enterprise has to fill in forms separately with each department it deals with each interaction. I mean, being able to use the same data across various arms of government, various departments of government is something that will possibly happen over a period of time. There are already initiatives in that direction. The Unique ID project is one such initiative which intends to bring a lot of this together. The last area I'd like to talk about in terms of the changing focus is the globalized public services. I think this is something that's not happened at all in India so far. There is an initiative in the European Union, for example, where they are collaborating amongst countries. So e-governance initiatives, collaboration amongst various countries is happening. And I think India will need to be part of the system, especially in critical areas related to security, how we are able to establish cross-border identity of people. Unless systems of multiple countries talk, that system will not be able to succeed. So as well as being able to integrate some of our healthcare systems to be able to ensure that disease surveillance networks, for example, when you have people coming from other countries, how you're able to track that in an active manner and also feed it to other countries. So there are areas where cross-border public services e-governance will gain in focus. So I think, just summarize, the technology governance will play a vital role. The private sector will be increasingly involved in governance given the stated direction of PPP in the government National E-Governance Plan and the issues related to funding and sharing of risks, as well as bringing in expertise in IT. New elements will transform the way e-governance projects are delivered, and the focus of e-governance will undergo a change. With that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you very much.